upstate New York, no, upstate, mid-state or
Upstate.
upstate?
Upstate.
New York, yeah.
So you
And,
say,
Did his master's level at the University of Notre Dame, and music. His wife told me that he doesn't, it's not going to have a master's of arts like usual. He's got an MM. So what's that? It's something, a candy, you know.
M&M.
Anyway, he's actually a semester of music, so, and he's currently, just recently moved out of the cathedral in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina, and has taken a position with Scott Presbyterian Church there, and is enjoying his new experience there. So, anyway, it's a pleasure to have him with us. Just a little story. He graduated from the program, his master's at Notre Dame, as I indicated, and the professor was there. How many years was he there, Dan?
A number of years.
What?
28 years.
20 or 30 years?
28.
28 years.
Pardon me?
He said
28.
28 years? Oh,
Yeah.
28 years. And they wanted to put on a special event for him. And so what they did is he selected, the professor selected, 5 of his pupils he had taught over that 28 years to give a concert for him. And Dan was one of the 5. So that's really quite an honor. I mean, and he, in all his wisdom, decided that he was going to do the piece that he played, or the composition that he played, for his degree. And it's a complicated tongue twister and a hand twister and a leg twister. So anyway, he's going to do that. When is that concert, Dan?
September 21st.
Okay. So I give you Dan. Dan Sansone. You're gonna see some of his crazy talents just this afternoon.
Thank you for the brief introduction, Drew.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. Let's get over this way, because I'm blocking this view. Again, welcome. I'm delighted to be here this morning. I know that your discernment process and your whole process to eventually becoming ordained as deacons is one of great importance to all. And to us as Catholic Christians, the ministry that you provide for us is amazing. So as you continue your journey through your formation process, please be assured of my prayers for you all, and wife's as well. We've got one here this morning, which is great, hopefully another one on the way. But I think it's fabulous, it's wonderful. So what I'd like to do this morning is, and please keep in mind, folks, this is very informal. So, you know, along the way, if you want to ask questions, raise your hand, make comments, throw something at me, that's okay, you can do that too. But what we're going to do is spend the morning here pretty much, we'll talk about the overview, and then have the opportunity this afternoon to go over to the cathedral. You're going to get a chance to go up in the choir loft, take a look at the organ, talk about the organ a little bit, and I'll play a few short little pieces for you to hear, so we'll give you hands-on experience for that. And then we'll go down in the choir room and work a little bit with singing, and I know some of you that's kind of intimidating for you, and we'll hope that we'll make that a little less intimidating. Yes?
What is your experience with children in singing?
In both the last 2 positions I had, we had a graded children's choir that followed the Royal School of Church Music, which was a course of study. So I've had quite a bit of work with children's choirs, and it's one of God's great gifts. It's difficult to keep kids involved, you know, in parishes with all the things they have going on, but you know, they are the future of the church. They feed into the future of our church.
If someone said that learning a foreign language as a child is very easy compared to being an adult, does the same thing go with singing?
I think so, and we can talk about this a little bit more. My experience has been when children start at a young age, you know, taking music lessons or singing in choir, yeah, that's the time to do it. They're young and they're formidable at that age. I can always tell, for example, when I have a children's choir, most of the time I can tell whether those kids have had any type of musical instrument instruction, like if they've taken piano or violin or whatever, because they have a greater aptitude for reading music. So I think it's important, you know, to get your child interested in some type of music early on, you know. And you know, it's one of those things that once they get interested and, you know, they get into it, they enjoy it, but, you know. And unfortunately, in so many, you know, schools, certainly not here with the fabulous Cathedral School, but, you know, the arts programs they're the first things to be cut, you know, which is really unfortunate because, you know, you talk about a well-rounded education, well, you know, that includes everything. That's academics, you know, sports, music,
Arts.
performing and visual art. And it seems like so many times, you know, those are the things that tend to go by the wayside, you know. So, you know, we as artists always, you know, want to encourage and support young people that are interested in, you know, any of the performing or visual arts. Really, really important. So, having said that, so let me tell you a little bit about myself. We'll get started here, and then we'll talk a little bit. So today what we'll do this morning is we'll go through some introductions, some brief introductions. Spend a good part of this morning kind of a historical perspective of music in the church, and then music and worship. And then this afternoon we'll kind of go more so toward the practicum point of things. And again, along the way, if you want to ask any questions, there are no questions that are not, you know, legitimate. And if I can't answer it, I will find out for you. How's that? I'll say, you know what, I don't know that, but I'm certainly willing to find out. So, a little bit about myself. As you can see, I had some help putting this PowerPoint presentation together, and I can give you 3 guesses who that might be. And the first 2 guys in the front row there, that's Millie and Oscar, our 2 Airedales. And Kelly said, you know what, I've got to touch base with these guys again, see how CRS Roy School is going. So she had her finger in this as well. So at any rate, she gives her best to all of you, enjoyed her time with you back in December when she was here. So I was born and raised in upstate New York, Syracuse, New York. Actually, I still have family up there. Gosh, I can remember loving music from a really, really early age. My mom's side of the family, my Irish side, my grandmother played piano, my aunt did, and I just remember from an early age thinking, you know, I want to do something with music. You know, I mean, this is what I want to do with my life. So when I was an altar boy, this was a little bit pre-Vatican II, when we switched over to Vatican II. The highlight for me every week was going to serve High Mass, because I got to hear the choir and I got to hear the organ. And that's, I think, when I first really got the bug of, wow, I was just really blown away by the pipe organ. So I loved to, you know, serve Mass and High Mass so I could hear the organ. And I thought, this would be neat. I wish I could say I was a child prodigy. I was a late bloomer, actually. My first instrument, believe it or not, was a harmonica. And I'll never forget my parents when I was about 7 years old. I unwrapped this thing under the Christmas tree and it was a harmonica, and I thought, I have no idea what to do with this. Well, lo and behold, I did, because I drove them crazy, actually. But got the musical bug there, and then moved to the accordion when I was in junior high and high school. I still have the accordion, I still play it. So up to that, my high school, I couldn't read music. I played by ear. I could listen to something on the radio, or my parents would play a record, and I would just sit down and play it. But to read a note of music, couldn't do it. At the time, when I was entering high school, the Diocese of Syracuse in New York had what they called an organist training program. And if you were accepted into the program and played like 1 or 2 masses a month at your parish, the tuition for your organ lessons was provided by your parish, which was a fabulous, fabulous program for young people wanting to get into church music. So I, bluffed my way through the audition and got into the program, and eventually started really formal organ and piano study in high school. So I was a late bloomer. So, but
That doesn't
nonetheless,
sound late to me.
well, as you were, and that dovetails right back into your question a little bit ago about young people starting at an early age. I think you're never too late to start, but I think the earlier the better. I was accepted into the organ performance program at the State University of New York in Fredonia, which is a state school system. Fredonia, if you don't know where that is out in western New York, about an hour and a half south of Buffalo. Rough winters, just like Syracuse was and like you have here. And I had a fabulous professor, Dr. John Hoffman, who got his DMA in organ from Eastman a number of years ago. So I had a wonderful experience there. It was fabulous, fabulous education. I was a double major, organ, performance, and education. And then I got to my third year and I thought, you know, education is not the thing for me. I really want to go to performance and church work. So I did. Graduated and immediately went into ministry, Catholic ministry. Spent a number of years in Florida, in the Diocese of St. Petersburg. Was in Sarasota for a few years, quite a bit in St. Petersburg, a number of years there, and Palm Beach, was at the Cathedral in Palm Beach for a couple of years. So I was in church ministry and doing fine and everything, and you know, one day a friend of mine said, you know, have you ever given thought to going back and, you know, doing your master's? And I thought, not really. You know, I had 2 boys and, you know, things were going along. And they said, well, you know, this family, they were a wonderful family. They were, the dad and all the sons were graduates of Notre Dame. So they said, let's take you to Notre Dame for a football weekend. I said, okay, that's fine. So we went to Notre Dame for a football weekend, so it was great. Talked to the organ professor there, and I said, you know, you really need to audition. So long short of it, I auditioned in 1995, was awarded a full scholarship to the University of Notre Dame.
Wow.
So it was a 2 years master's program, full scholarship plus a tuition. I worked in the Office of Campus Ministry, which means I did a couple of the choirs, did a couple of handbell choirs. It was unbelievable experience and a gift that I can never repay. It was amazing. Great 2 years there. Dr. Craig Kramer was the organ professor there. His wife, Gail Walton, was actually the director of music at the Basilica. Unfortunately, she untimely passed away a few years ago, but Craig is getting ready to retire, and that's when I'll be going out in September and doing a recital as a part of his retirement. So I spent my 2 years there, finished my master's degree, and they said, hey, you know, if you want to stick with Holy Cross, there's a position out in campus ministry at the University of Portland in Oregon. And I'm like, that's a long ways away. But at any rate, so went out there, auditioned, and entered for that position, and took that position. So I worked for...
I graduated from University of Portland.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I spent 2 years there in the Office of Campus Ministry and adjunct on the music faculty as an organ and harpsichord professor, which was great. I loved it there. And then my third and final year there, I actually switched gears and took a part-time position at St. Mary's Cathedral as organist and worked full-time as a music editor for Oregon Catholic Press. And I thought, this is interesting, but it was a great experience for me because it was a whole different side of music.
Where's St. Mary's?
St. Mary's Cathedral in Portland, the Immaculate Conception, the Catholic Cathedral. Yeah, right downtown on
Is that the one they were renovating, right?
They did a number of years ago. They did a stunning renovation of that, actually, yeah. So I was working full-time as an editor, which was great. It was a great experience for me. Got to meet a lot of different composers. You know, it was a great experience, but I really missed church work doing that full-time because I was just part-time at the cathedral at the time. So the position opened up at the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen in Baltimore. So I'm thinking, well, you know, my family's back on the East Coast. And at the time I'd met McKaylee, and she had had an interview with Catholic Relief Services. So she had her first interview. So we went to Baltimore, auditioned there at the cathedral. She did her interview at Catholic Relief Services and moved to Baltimore. So I was at the cathedral there for 13 years, which was amazing. Just it was an amazing experience for me. And we got to the point where we said, you know, we're kind of tired of winter, you know? Moved south.
Florida.
Well, and I lived in Florida for a number of years. So at any rate, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist opened up in Charleston, and I thought, well, you know, it's something to look at. So we did. I was offered that position, and so we moved in 2014 up to Charleston, where we're currently living, and at the cathedral there for 5 years. And Michaela got the opportunity to work from home with Catholic Relief Services, which was great. You know, she does a lot of traveling and so forth. So we were able to make the move. So we left Baltimore January 2nd. It was 6 degrees above zero, and I said, I don't care if I ever see winter again. So, but at any rate, we love Charleston. And then in January, as Drew said, I accepted a new position at First Scots Presbyterian Church. You might say, well, you know, why that? All of my experience has been in the Catholic Church, aside from a couple part-time jobs that I had when I was in college. And I'm a cradle Catholic. But I needed a break, and what I found is we needed to spend our time together more so, and be able to worship together as husband and wife, because we don't get to do that. You know, she may come to mass with me, but she's sitting downstairs, I'm directing the choir or upstairs, and I said, you know, we really need to, you know, work on us spending time together, being able to worship together. So, made the change, and First Scots is a very historical church in Charleston, large staff, great music program, and so it's been good, you know, so I may eventually go back into the Catholic Church. I'm sure I'll miss it at some point, which I do already, but it was time for a break, so that's kind of what I'm doing. But you know, it's been a great opportunity for me, and enjoying it. So that's that. So why don't we go with some introductions here? We can start with you and just you know, introduce yourselves. Tell me a little bit of what parish you're affiliated with, and then you have to name your favorite composer. Okay? So who do we want to start with?
My name is Jeff Allen. I'm from St. Vincent de Paul Parish.
Okay.
And my favorite composer, I don't know.
Don't have
If I
one.
have one.
That's okay. You may have one by the end of the day.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you, Jeff.
Tom Devereaux, sir. I'm from St. Mary's up in the north, about 35 miles north of here.
Okay.
So, favorite composer, that's something that, you know, I truly enjoy the Moldau.
Really?
So was that Smetana?
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
I took a class, I was in the band for years, and even though I can't play a lick now. But I grew up, like I said, ballet and
Yeah.
music, and my mom played by ear. So I
Wonderful.
grew up with that. My great-grandfather was a honky-tonk piano player at a bar. But anyway, so I was exposed to that a lot.
Uh-huh.
I took a class at the U on classical music.
Wonderful.
And I really enjoyed what they call, I think they call it program music. You know,
Yes.
I can't understand, I don't understand like Tchaikovsky's Second or, you know, Beethoven's. I don't, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Sure.
Moldau is the story of a river. You can
Right.
picture this river going through the wedding, and you can
Yep.
experience it as though you're just floating down a canoe
Yes.
and seeing all of this take place.
Yep.
You know, Finlandia is another type of.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
so I enjoy
Sibelius.
that type of music far more than, oh, look at Tchaikovsky playing tomorrow.
Right.
I don't understand, I don't.
Sure.
I don't.
Sure.
I don't
Well, that's
gravitate
great.
toward that. So
But
gravitate-
look at your great opera, your ballet, and
Yeah.
it's wonderful. So good.
Jeremy and Melissa.
Hi, Melissa. Nice to meet you as well.
Nice to meet
Thank you.
We're just new parishioners. We switched over to the cathedral
Oh, awesome.
recently, and
Good.
I don't have a favorite composer.
Don't have a favorite composer. Okay, that's okay.
Non-musical. Sorry.
That's okay. We'll work on that. Awesome. Good. And
Hi, I'm Greg Working from St. Thomas More, and my favorite composer, I don't really have one. I have a favorite genre of music. I love female jazz singers, and I love jazz. So
I'm right with you.
Nina Simone and Nancy Wilson, those are the people I listen to most
Uh-huh.
of the time.
Awesome. Great.
I'm Robert Kalishaw. I'm at St. Vincent's for my practicum. I actually come from a parish out west, St. Francis Xavier. A very diverse parish. Frank Zappa would probably be my favorite composer.
Frank Zappa. That's
But my wife laughs, but it's not his, it's his compositions that he did,
Uh-huh.
you know, that were long riffs. That really got me into classical, believe it or not.
there you go.
So, and Rachmaninoff, I think would be one of my favorite.
Who
Awesome.
doesn't like Rachmaninoff?
Yeah.
That's impressive. Good. Well, it's fine that you don't have a favorite composer, and you know, we'll talk about some composers today as we get into our presentation a little bit. And it's nice to have Father Silva with us as well. Father, it's always nice to see you.
They already know me, Father Silva for Sacred Heart. I think for church music is Palestrina.
Mhm. Very good. Okay, well, let's start. We're going to get into the history just a little bit today as we talk about, begin looking at early Christian music. And Christian music has been used to proclaim the gospel and give thanks to praise to God all through the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Feel free to take notes if you'd like to. So when we look at the Old Testament, We
I
find
have a
that
question.
Yes.
Will you share your PDF at the end?
Yes, thank you for reminding me. Michaela asked me to do that, and I'll leave that with Drew so we can get a copy of that as well. Yes. So if we look at music in the Old Testament, it was an important component of both temple and synagogue worship. And this is interesting as I was writing this and doing my research on this. Does anyone have any idea or any thoughts on what the difference between a temple and a synagogue is?
Yeah, I mean, synagogue is an educational area, if you will. I mean, we think correct me if I'm wrong. I think people wrongly believe a synagogue is a place of worship, and it's where you went to hear the word and to be instructed, not
Right.
to praise and as you would in the temple.
Right.
You see a lot of synagogues being unearthed in the Middle East today.
Right.
They have evidence of, the benches around the side where the speaker sat in the middle, stood in the middle, and you sat on the outside,
Right.
listening to him orate. But you didn't go there to necessarily worship as you would a temple.
Right, right. And really, by most sects of Judaism, a temple really referred to the ancient temple in Jerusalem. So up until about 200 years ago, the Jewish house of worship was called a temple. So the word synagogue comes from a Greek word meaning literally house of assembly. So that's what we refer to as a synagogue. That's the Greek word. In Hebrew, the term used is Beit Knesset, and that literally means the same thing, house of assembly. So when you look at the two, very good insights on that as well. It's interesting just to note that as we look at that. So as we look at Jews and Christians, they both revere a transcendent God and give honor to Scripture. And so there are similarities between the synagogue and the Jewish worship service. As we look to the New Testament, from the beginning of the New Testament, the Christian response to Jesus has included song. So as you look at the history, song has always been included in Christian worship. I'm sure you're familiar with the Magnificat, which is the Marian evening canticle for Vespers, the Noctimedes, which is the canticle for Compline at the end of the day, the Benedictus and the Gloria. These all came from the New Testament, which is interesting to note. And of course, we still have those with us today, and it's still very much a part of our worship service. Yes?
Do we know our earliest hymn?
We'll talk about that a little bit later on. If you look at some of the ancient hymns, like the Saint Thomas Aquinas, the Tantum Ergo, or the Pange Lingua, those are like 9th century. And we're coming up to look at some of the history of that. But
Nothing before that?
very little is known. We'll talk about that in just a bit.
All right.
Great question. So in the New Testament, it included hymns, spiritual songs, and psalmody as well. So if you look at the book of Psalms, it's the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, and the first book of the Ketuvim, which is that 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible. And so it's a book of the Old Testament. So the Psalms are some of the earliest songs of our Christian existence there. So, great. So as we continue on, I want to take a little look at the early church, and we'll get back to your question. So for the first 3 centuries, not a whole lot was really known about music beyond the texts and the liturgical forms. There's not a whole lot of information for us to go on in terms of really what went on in the early church in the first 3 centuries. As we look at the music from, for example, the Eastern Church, and the inclusion of Gregorian chant in the West, the Western Church, we can assume that these settings were similar to that of Eastern music. So, we're going to talk about Gregorian chant in a little bit, and that's a whole other topic for us to discuss. But so that's interesting point. As we look at other Christian influences, the Byzantine Orthodox, for example, is thought to be a direct descendant of the music in the synagogues during Jesus' time. So that's the Orthodox, Byzantine Orthodox. The Orthodox tradition, I think this is just fabulous. they believe that music is a window to heaven. Isn't that amazing? It's an amazing concept for them to think of, that it's such transcendent, that it's a window to heaven. And so for those that also did write icons, they viewed those as well, as windows of heaven. So you've gotten a sense that the visual art of the icons being written and the actual music as well, both kind of interpreting those as a window to heaven, just a foretaste of what we can look forward to. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, my goodness, most of the liturgy is chanted and sung. If you've ever been to a Greek Orthodox liturgy, they go on forever. They're 2-3 hours long, and everything is sung. So beautiful liturgies, but quite long. So that's kind of the history of the early church as we look at that and the other Christian influences there. Good. Is there any questions so far?
Do you know any current Catholic composers?
Yes.
And are they thriving?
We'll talk about that too. There are some contemporary composers, or some of the 20th century that we'll be talking about in a little bit as well as we get into the next portion of our presentation. Okay, so then this is where things really begin to get wonderful and interesting. We're going to move into the medieval area in Western Church, Gregorian chant, and we're going to talk a little bit about polyphony. We're going to have a chance this afternoon to sing some Gregorian chant, so we'll talk about that as we get to that as well.
Do they have schools for Gregorian chant that lay people can go to?
There are a number of summer studies that they have. Yes, there are any number. Yale Institute of Music has one. Steubenville has one. St. John's University in Collegeville has one. Catholic University in DC does as well. So there are any number of, you don't have to be a trained musician. You can be a lay person that if you want to take a summer study course in Gregorian chant, you can. And there's been a great revival in chant, as we all know, and there's plenty of opportunities. Yeah. So in the Middle Ages, there was a gradual dominance of in the Roman Rite over the local rites, and this took place probably between the 9th and the 10th century. And this gave way to the really beginning of the spread of Gregorian chant. Okay. Why is it referred to as Gregorian chant? Does anyone know?
St. Gregory?
Pope Gregory.
Pope Gregory?
Okay. That's correct. The truth of the matter is, more than likely, even though we attribute it to Pope Gregory, that's probably not where it really its origin came from. More than likely it came from Carolinian synthesis of Roman and Gallican chant. Carolinian from the Frankish dynasty. So when we hear of Gregorian chant, oh yeah, Pope Gregory, but that's really not been proven, and this is probably where it came from, a synthesis of those two different chants. From chant, we will move into 3 other different types of music, and finally arrive at polyphony, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So, with Gregorian chant, if you notice the graphic that I have up here is from a very old choir book. In music, on our modern music, we have a 5 staff for music, then 5 lines of music. So you've got the 5 lines and the 4 spaces of music, that's our modern staff. They didn't have that hundreds of years ago. It was actually a 4-line staff, and there was not our modern, if you think of our modern scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, there was not even the modern scale. There were the 8 church modes. So there were 8 modes of, that the composers could use to write Gregorian melodies. And if you look at the notes, you're thinking, wow, that doesn't look like a kind of a regular musical note that you see. This is what they would call, or original notation, or they were called neumes, N-E-U-M-E-S. And every one of them, some of them are the same, some of them are different. We could spend weeks just talking about that, but that was these were, you know, this is the way that the forerunners of our modern system of reading and notating music. A lot of churches that still do a fair amount of Gregorian chant will read from original manuscripts. At the cathedral I was in Charleston both and in Baltimore, the choirs read from the original notation.
Wow.
It's difficult. It's difficult to learn, but once you learn it, it's actually much more simpler to sing than the modern 5-stat system. What is interesting about this, and which is so amazing, we think of this back hundreds of years ago, is a lot of the notes had different names, and some looked the same. But what was interesting is there were ways of notating the music, so the inflections of the music with the text. That's what really made this so special. And you look at Gregorian, you think, you know, Gregorian chant, it is so simple, but yet so difficult to sing well. You know, as we look at, and we all know chants, we're going to do a couple of them this afternoon, but I think what is so intrinsically beautiful about chant is just its simplicity, you know, and it never, you never lose that sense. And what is so beautiful about chant, I think, is just the way the text is wedded to the music. So, yes, Chris?
Maybe when you sing it's differently, but there's no clef either in that music.
Awesome observation. That's right. There was no treble clef, there was no bass clef, there was no alto clef. So do, as in the first degree of the scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So do was movable. So you could start at a high pitch if you want to, or you could start at a low pitch. It doesn't matter. Whereas on your modern scale, middle C is, you know, where it is. That's a great observation. That's awesome. So there was no clefs because they were written in these church modes, and so it was a movable clef. So this is the great repertoire of, you know, the church and the monasteries and so forth. But of course, as with anything, that began to grow and develop. So as we moved from Gregorian chant, it got more complicated now to what we call organum, O-R-G-A-N-U-M. And now instead of one line of music being sung, there were two lines of music being sung simultaneously. That was called organum. And so a lot of music was written for organum. And that developed into triplum, which would be 3 lines of music. So you're seeing that the melodies are getting more complicated and you're adding melodies to the original Gregorian melody. And then, so we went from organum to triplum, and then finally to polyphony. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. How many of you have sung Gregorian chant? I'm sure you have in liturgies or services, or not really? No?
I'm anxious to try.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we'll do it in modern notation, but nonetheless, you know, it's beautiful music. So when we look at polyphony, a couple things is we're singing more than 1 or 2 or 3 parts. More so, we're singing 4 or more parts. Okay. So you're simultaneously singing not just one melody, but 3 or 4, as would a choir, for example. Okay, if you're choral singing, if they were doing soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, 4 parts. So, and it got more complicated as polyphony developed. The golden age of polyphony was probably roughly between 1400 to probably 1650, okay? That's where you have the greatest body and the greatest opus of polyphonic music, choral music. So even after that, composers still favored contrapuntal style. Bach did, for example, Brahms did, even 20th century composers did. And you'll see, you know, 20th century composers, and many times in their compositions, and we'll look ahead to that in just a few minutes, you know, it's the tip of the hat back to that period and that style of music. So it's a lasting style that really never is faded. If anything, it's been constantly reworked with many composers. We'll talk about that a little bit later on.
I have a question.
Yes.
The composers back then that were in the golden age, were they devout?
Yeah, most of them were, and we're going to talk about that too as we get into Palestrina and some of the composers in just a little bit. But many of them were, so many of the composers were actually clergy, were priests. You know, especially back in the Renaissance period like that. So I mean, it was very much so. So when we're talking about polyphony, four different melodies coming together, they're moving independently, what we call contrapuntally. That means, you know, so there are four separate lines of music that are being sung at the same time, okay, to weave this musical fabric. So when you look at choral music, for example, from the Renaissance period, the music of Palestrina and Byrd and Thomas Tallis, very complex, and that music was an outgrowth, if you can think of that, amazingly, it was an outgrowth of chant. But chant has been retained all these hundreds of years. So that was really the opus of church music, you know, in the Middle Ages, right on straight through the Renaissance period. Interesting. So when we look at composers, we're going to look at some composers. I've chosen, there's hundreds of them, but I've chosen 3 or 4 that probably are you know, have the most impact and represent this opus of music. But before we do that, it's interesting to note that over the course of the hundreds of years that we look back on this and look back at music, our popes throughout the ages have always made comments or made observations about music. So I thought it'd be neat to share just a couple of them with you today. And this is a quote from our beloved Pope John Paul VI. He writes, "If music, instrumental and vocal, does not possess at the same time the sense of prayer, dignity, and beauty, it precludes the entire entry into the sphere of the sacred and the religious." That's pretty profound.
What does it mean? It means it has to be sacred from the beginning?
Well, he talks about the sense of prayer, dignity, and beauty. So our music is sung prayer, right? I mean, our sung prayer, whether we're speaking prayer or we're singing, all of that enters into our worship experience and enters into the sacred. And we'll talk a little bit about that coming up with why we sing and what ways we do it. But I think it's amazing. St. Pius X, in his document Motu Proprio, which was in November 22nd, 1902, wrote, "Sacred music has always been an essential part of the liturgy because it is an integral part of the solemn liturgy. It participates in the general scope of that same sacred action." So in a sense, the ritual action in the music are not separate. They're one.
And if you've ever been to a mass about music, you see that how you get the sense of what's missing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's, you know, it's amazing for me, like if I go to a daily mass and there's not music, you know, obviously I'm a musician, but there's something that's missing, you know, I mean, there's just, and you know, for some folks, the music is, you know, it might be not bothersome, but it's, you know, it's something that it makes the mass longer or whatever, but I can't imagine not having music be a part of our prayer.
So, 2 things. One, I remember going to daily mass here at the cathedral and not expecting the children's choir to start singing, and all of a sudden it started singing, and I'm going, wow! And then the same thing happened to me. I went to mass in Orlando. They have a special basilica, Mary, Queen of the Universe.
Oh yes, outside of Orlando, yeah.
And I'm sitting there in mass, and all of a sudden I hear this music, and it just gets shivers in my spine. And I asked, why is it so beautiful? And they said, well, they hire professional musicians and singers.
Wow.
And it just, I mean, my skin was tingling. It was so pretty.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just, I mean, you know, so we'll talk a little bit about ritual and so forth as it relates to our worship, Catholic worship, but, you know, I just can't imagine worship without music.
You know, Dan, I struggle even bringing this up because you are a musician. But A mass without music is one thing, and I agree, it seems empty
Yeah.
and whatnot. The other side of that is when the music, we are called to participate in mass.
Right.
And there's so much music over my head that it's almost like I'm attending a concert.
Right.
And I'm just sitting there listening, I don't have a clue what we're doing. That's not good either.
Right.
In my opinion. So you got this no music and too much music, and we're sitting there as parishioners thinking, where is he going?
Right.
What are we doing? I'm
Yeah.
just sitting here.
Yeah.
So that's not, in my opinion, not good either.
And that's the balance
Yeah.
of things, yeah, and we'll talk about
Be
that.
entertained, I'm here to participate.
Right, absolutely, and that's, when we talk about our worship experience, and there's opportunities within our liturgy for both, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then, our current Pope, Pope Francis, wrote, "Your music and song are truly an instrument of evangelization." Interesting, okay,
Amen.
evangelization to the extent that you bear witness to the depth of the Word of God. Okay, so, let's stop there just for a second. How does or how can music evangelize?
Because it says right there that it takes it gives you the feeling of depth to the core.
Yes, that's right.
Music, we all come to celebrate and to worship with different backgrounds and
Absolutely.
and cultural contexts.
Yeah.
And music, it oftentimes can bring that together, you know.
Absolutely.
So you bring down a lot of barriers by singing and whatnot, that you don't have to sit there and explain to me cerebrally what's going on.
That's right.
You can enjoy it
That's
to the
right.
heart.
Right.
And not realize that I'm in tune with you, I'm just enjoying it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would say I'm here because of music. I was at a conference in Park City maybe 10 years ago, and it was a conference on Mary, and I was, I listened to a section, and I got up and went next door where they were selling DVDs and rosaries and stuff like
Yeah.
that, and I heard some music, and it just hit me. I stopped, I put everything down, and went over there, and a Catholic musician named Andy Carto was singing the Divine Mercy Chaplet, and I was just mesmerized.
Oh, wow.
And that started my journey here.
Yeah, that's amazing. And those are all personal journeys for all of us. And you know, we'll talk about this a little bit later on too. You know, we all come with, you know, different experiences from our worship and you know, and your formative process is becoming deacons. But, you know, the basic premise of all this is, you know, whatever we do is in praise of God, you know, and that's, and music is, you know, helps us to do that. So, continuing on, which touches people's hearts, and to the extent that you assist in the celebration of the sacraments, in particular the Holy Eucharist, allowing us to perceive the beauty of paradise. So, Pope Francis talks about, you know, music is evangelization, you know, bringing greater depth and greater meaning to the Word of God, the written word and the spoken word. And then all of that really, you know, comes in line with the you know, the summation of what we're about as Roman Catholic Christians, and that's what? The Eucharist, right? The celebration of the Eucharist. So all of these things, you know, come in. And within all of that, you know, we get a window to heaven. We get a foretaste of heaven in the music that we hear and we sing and that we participate in. And sometimes it's participatory in the sense that we're singing it, whether it's a psalm or a hymn, or sometimes it's whether you're listening to a beautiful choral piece, you know, or an instrumental piece.
Well, it happens a lot that just throughout your week, for whatever reason, one of the songs from Mass will pop in your head.
I know,
And
isn't
then
that
you
true?
start singing, so you may not remember like what the liturgy was about, but
That's true.
if the music comes back to you throughout the week.
And you may think of, well, you know, the song that I heard at communion or at the offertory or even the psalm response that we sang, you know, simple psalm response. It just keeps going through my mind, you know,
Yeah.
and it sticks with you, you know, and that's where it becomes meaningful for you.
Yeah, and then, I mean, then you do start to think back, like, oh, like, what was the readings and what.
Right.
So I think maybe that's what he means by evangelizing.
absolutely.
Like it calls back to your mind, like what happened.
And how many, absolutely, it's an awesome observation. And how many of you, when you hear, and I'm not even talking, like religious songs or music that we hear music, how many times have you had the experience where you hear a song and it brings you back to that particular, whether you were a child, and say your parents sang you a song, or something that was, sung at your wedding, or a family gathering, or an anniversary, or whatever, and you hear that piece of music or that you sung, gosh, I remember that event, this long ago, And that's the beauty of our rich heritage of church music, is because it goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it still is it's still with us, it's still here. We don't, we haven't thrown that out, and that's, I think, and that's what, we refer to as the beauty and the sacredness of music, is it's held that through hundreds and hundreds of years. And you say, well, that's Gregorian chant and it's old stuff, we don't sing that anymore. And that's not to say that, music that's been written in the 19th and 20th and coming up in the 21st century is certainly not valid. It most certainly is, in a much different way. But anyway, 3 quotes that I thought that would be interesting for us to kind of reflect on as we look at this. So now that we talked a little bit about the church and what our popes have said about music, we're going to take a look at some of the famous 5 or the famous 3 composers as we look at liturgical music, and in particular focusing much more on Catholic church music. Palestrina, Giovanni Pierluigi de Palestrina. Does someone know Palestrina? Yes? Palestrina is actually a little town in Italy. And so it's Giovanni basically from Palestrina. So his last name really wasn't Palestrina, he was from Palestrina, but he was called Giovanni Pierluigi de Palestrina. So his dates we calculate between 1525 and 1594. Without question, Palestrina was probably the most influential 16th century composer of the Roman school, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. His output, he wrote 105 masses, how about that, and over 250 choral motets, which is just amazing, and that's just masses and choral music.
Was he at the Vatican?
Pardon me?
Was the Vatican, was the Pope and him intertwined?
Vatican and Rome, yes. We'll talk about that a little bit too. In fact, we'll get into that in just a little bit. So back in during the period here, the 16th century, masses were usually written sine nomine. You know what sine nomine means? Sine nomine.
Without something.
Good.
Name?
Nomine.
Without name,
Okay.
no name.
So what is sine nomine? Well, that means composers used no pre-existing musical source material. Okay, and a lot of composers did during that time. So in other
Like a
words,
blank sheet of paper?
correct. So to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write a mass.
Right from scratch.
I'm not going to use a melody or a Gregorian melody that I heard or a hymn that I heard or whatever. So many masses during the Renaissance were called sine nomine, so they weren't without a name.
I have a question.
Yes,
Sorry to interrupt you.
that's not an interruption.
So you talk about they're doing a mass. So do they take the words of the mass and write music around them?
Good
Or does the
question.
music come first and then they're putting in some words to match that?
Sure.
I don't even know how that works.
That's a great question. Many times when composers, when they begin a composition, they will have a text in front of them. Even popular composers that'll sit down and they'll have a person that writes the libretto or the text, and then they'll put the music together. Well, obviously during the Renaissance period, where many of these composers are writing music for the church, obviously their template or their landscape was the mass, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Sanctus, on
The mass parts.
What's that?
The mass parts.
Yeah, the mass parts, absolutely.
Which are all with the same text.
Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, obviously, different motets based on Marian antiphons or scriptural and so forth. So this mass is probably he wrote, as I said, a huge opus of mass. This is probably his most familiar mass. And this was traditionally sung at papal coronations and
Wow.
in Rome. It was composed in 1562 in honor of Pope Marcellus II, and it's a beautiful mass. I've done it. I've performed it and conducted it many times. It's a treasure if you have the chance to listen to it. So Palestrina might become one of your favorite composers if you don't have one. So, what was the Roman school of composition? Well, that was this was a group of composers predominantly writing church music. They were based in Rome, and most of these composers had a direct connection either to the Vatican in the papal chapel. A lot of times we can view Palestrina really is in the sense of saving the church at the time. He was actually employed to write music because at that time there was a lot of what we thought was profane music being written for the church, and Palestrina was thought is kind of like the person that pulled us back into the realm of the spiritual in terms of the music being written. So, and a lot of these composers also worked in courts, various courts in Europe. They were court musicians. They had church musicians, but they worked in various courts of kings and emperors and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little bit with some other composers as well. But Palestrina was certainly, the composer. Another type of mass that was written during the Renaissance period was called the parody mass. And with the parody mass, that meant that they usually they either used some of their own music that they had written earlier on, or from someone else to start their composition. So that was basically the difference between the Sine Nomine mass and a parody mass. So, if you look at someone like Palestrina, he did not have to be rediscovered. The music that he wrote was written during the time, it was used during the time, and it was carried on for generations. Let's take a look at Bach for just a few minutes, Johann Sebastian Bach, whose dates were 1685 to 1750. Again, tremendous outpouring of music that he wrote. Bach's music was not appreciated at all during his time. A lot of times people felt his music was too modern, they felt that it was too involved, too technical, too difficult. And so Bach didn't enjoy the option and the beauty of having his music be appreciated and employed at the time, as, for example, Palestrina did. So, does anyone know who kind of resurrected the music of Bach, another composer later on in the early Romantic period? Anyone know who was responsible for really, this person was responsible for really resurrecting Bach and all his music? Felix Mendelssohn. Felix Mendelssohn. And we'll talk a little bit about him later on too. So, Palestrina enjoyed this. He came from a very wealthy family, and obviously a very prolific composer in terms of his output of music and what he did. When we think of Mozart, do we think of church music with Mozart?
No, not usually. Operas and stuff.
Ah, good. Okay, good. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about Mozart. 1756 to 1791. So he was born 6 years later than Bach's death date, 1685 to 1750. And I often think, and many musicians do, and many people do, can you imagine what could have come had Mozart lived another 10, 20, 30, 40 years? I mean, look at, such a short lifespan. He wrote his first symphony when he was 6. 6 years old, can you imagine? 6!
Imagine his mom and dad.
Yeah. And so his dad and him and his sister, of course, they were touring Europe when he was, 8 or 9 or 10 years old. It's amazing. So when you think of Mozart, you think of you know, opera certainly, we'll talk about a couple of those. You think of symphonies, you think of chamber music, but you may not think of choral music, but in fact, he wrote a lot of choral music. His Requiem Mass is probably one of his most famous choral pieces. He completed it 1791. Well, let me take that back. He wrote it in 1791. He was in Vienna. That was his death year. He never completed it. He passed away before it was completed.
He was in the middle of writing the Magic Flute too, composing that.
Giselle wrote it, that's right. So when he died on December 5th, 1791, his symphony wasn't done. One of his most famous works. Well, a gentleman by the name of Franz Süssmayr completed the work just 1 year later in 1792. So again, if you have the chance, if you have the opportunity, listen to the Requiem Mass, and especially as you get to the final movements.
What does requiem mean?
Requiem means Mass for the Dead. So this was his Mass for the dead, and it was it's a gargantuan work. It's a towering work. But Mozart wrote a coronation Mass. He wrote a Missa Solemnis. He wrote a Mass in C minor. He wrote a number of Missa Brevis, which literally translates to smaller masses, which are used today in many parishes, and especially in Europe. If you go in churches in Europe, in Salzburg, in Germany, you'll hear a Haydn or a Mozart Missa Brevis. We do a lot of them in the cathedral in Charleston. They're shorter, brevis means shorter, and they're usually written for choir or smaller string ensemble. Lovely works, great works. And they can be used in the context of our worship because they aren't that long. So Mozart wrote them so they could be used in worship. And he wrote 3 settings of the Marian Antiphon Regina Coeli, which are also beautiful choral works. Are any of you familiar with the shorter choral motet, Ave Verum Corpus? You might hear that, okay? It's a choral motet. I'm sure they do it at the cathedral, and it is one of the most gorgeous choral pieces in our literature, but it's so short. It's like, in a minute, it's over. But it's based on the text of Ave Verum Corpus. So, and then of course, as you said, he wrote, hundreds of symphonies, chamber music, and opera as well. So, amazing. Just wondering what he would have written had he been alive a number of years. So we go from Mozart, we're going to go to William Byrd, contemporary of Palestrina. His dates are 1548 to 1623. He was probably one of the most famous composers of the English Renaissance, and we're going to mention that in a few minutes because of what the focus of compositions he wrote for the Catholic Church. So earlier on in his career, Byrd wrote in many of the forms current in England at the time. So earlier on in his career, he wasn't really writing music for the Roman Church. He was writing music, sacred music, pretty much for the Anglican Church, and a tremendous outpouring of choral music as well. But in the 1570s, he became a Catholic and immediately began to write music now for our Catholic worship service later in life. He wrote a number of masses, psalm settings, and graduale, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes.
When you say he writes for a Mass, does he start from the beginning, entrance song, all the way to the end? Everything?
Starting with the Kyrie, the Gloria, all the Mass ordinaries. Yeah. And he, so when he became Catholic, his composition, in other words, he wrote for the church. And when you look back over the history of composers over the years of their output in terms of their compositions, this was practical at the time because it was music that needed to be written. So it was written for the Mass. It was written for, Mass for the Dead, or just a regular Mass. For motets were written to be used during the Mass, for communion, for offertory, introits, and all like that. So I mean, their music was written specifically for a purpose, not simply for enjoyment or entertainment. For example, like a symphony. You know, you go to hear a symphony, you go to be entertained and hear the beautiful music. Well, these guys wrote for music specifically for the church. He wrote about 470 compositions.